perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to, remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's teaching.
In Buddhism, when Zen practitioners share their understandings of the teachings and practice, it's offered as a practice of dana paramita. Dana is a Pali word which means generosity or to give freely, and this is done without the expectation of anything in return when the opportunity arises. And those who share their teachings at Great Tree do so on a dana basis, so you can support their practice by giving what you can. So for Great Tree, you can go to our website, and there's a donate button on the upper right corner to donate to Great Tree. Our speaker today is the abbess of Great Tree, Rev Teijo Munnich. Teijo is a disciple and Dharma heir of Rev Dainin Katagiri. She studied with him from 1975 until his death in 1990, receiving formal training at Hokyoji in Minnesota, Tassajara Zen Mountain Center in California, and Hosshinji Sodo in Obama, Japan. Rev Munnich was ordained as a Zen priest in 1981. In 1983, she began to envision a practice center and a community, and at its heart, a residential practice for women. This came to be Great Tree Zen Women's Temple, incorporated in 2004. Thanks, Teijo. Welcome.
Morning. Morning. So in September, we're going to have something called the Mountain Seat Ceremony. It's basically an installation of abbess or an abbot of temple. And as some of you know, we actually moved into this place 20 years ago, but we were so busy trying to pay the mortgage that we couldn't afford to have this ceremony. But my disciple, Chimyo Atkinson, Reverend Chimyo Atkinson, has pursued this because she thinks that it's a very important thing for our temple, and I believe it is too. And I'm actually kind of glad that we're doing it now, because 20 years ago we weren't organized enough to have a lot of people here. So there's a lot of priests that come from all over the country and help with the ceremony. And it's a kind of a big deal, right? We're organizing it right now. Just having all those guests for a whole weekend is a lot of work. But then there's this whole ceremony that, although Chimyo and Gendo and I have all seen this ceremony, been attending at this ceremony. I was even part of a couple of them. It never occurred to me when I was at the ceremony to kind of figure out what was going on, because I wasn't thinking, oh, I'm going to do this someday. But here we are. And so last year I asked a couple of my friends who know a little bit more about this than I do to explain what a mountain seat ceremony is. And if you're interested in looking at any of those, they all kind of talked about it from a different perspective. So that's I think it's very valuable to take a look at that. It's at our website, and you can get to the YouTube videos about it by going to the website, greattreetemple.org, and then going to the, archives, and then past speakers. If you click past speakers, it brings you to all kinds of pictures, and all you have to do is click on the picture and take you to the YouTube videos. So there's a whole picture of just about the mountain seat ceremony. And it's very valuable, and especially I know like Christine is planning to come, so Christine for sure would want to check in on some of these videos. Probably seen all the talks already, but anyway, the first talk that was given last year was by Reverend Colin Franz. He's an American. Well, I don't know if he's an American. I think he's an American, but right now he is living in Canada. So he might be from Canada. I never asked him. But anyway, he had a pretty good understanding, and he's actually having one of these ceremonies this summer. And so I wanted to share a little bit about this with you because this is what I'm thinking about these days. So just to give you a little kind of foundation for what I want to talk about when I talk about mountains or becoming a mountain, is I want to sort of describe the path as he described it of someone who ordains in this Soto Zen tradition. And so the way he described it is that at the first point, the first thing is that after you ordain, you go to the mountain. And that means you go to the monastery and receive training at the monastery. And I want to read a little bit about what he said about that. He says, we refer to the process of entering a monastery as Jozan. That's a Japanese word. Jozan means to go up the mountain. The mountain is the monastery. The mountain has always been the monastery. All temples have a mountain name. So when we ascend that mountain, when we go up, we walk into this space that is at that stage a space of training, a space of cultivation, a space for education. And then he tells an interesting story. Probably some of you are familiar with it. He said, you might be familiar with the story of the Dragon Gate, that at the bottom of the sea there's a gate, and fish swim through this gate, and when they emerge on the other side of the gate, they're dragons. But the wonder of that, the beauty of that, is that they still look like fish, and they swim like fish, and they don't know that anything has happened. And yet, we say now they're dragons. We use this idea of a dragon gate to talk about the monastery, this mountain that we enter. And there's something that happens that we may think we understand in the moment, but probably we don't. And when we leave the monastery, we say it's Geizan, leaving the mountain, going back down the mountain. And then there's other ceremonies that he refers to, but the next one, the next kind of step is called Dharma combat ceremony. And this will actually be part of the ceremony in the fall because Genjo will be doing that as part of his training. And this is unlike the ordination ceremony, which is so intimate between teacher and student. This is kind of a public recognition or recognition among peers that you know something about the mechanics of how the mountain works. You're able to function in the mountain. You're able to make the machine of the mountain move. And you go back down, you go back into the world. And at some point, some very difficult to define moment later, there is another very, very private ceremony with the teacher in which you receive what we usually call transmission. This very private recognition that now you're in a position to welcome someone into this world, to send someone up that mountain. And often that's where the process stops. But there's this one more step. This is the mountain seat. And the one more step is what we call Shinsanchiki, which is the mountain seat ceremony. Shin means to ascend, but it's a different character from when we go up as a novice. And the ceremony, unlike the ceremonies before, is not invited by a teacher. It's not invited by your peers of monks and nuns. It's made possible by the community that you're in. It's in community that invites you to this next place that starts to recognize you as what? as the mountain itself. And when Cohen said that about you become the mountain, I just, something, I was like, oh my God. And, but it was like, it touched me in a very deep place. I felt it in my body when he said that. But then ever since then, as often happens in the Zen world, something will strike you. And then afterwards you start to ask, what was that anyway? What was that all about? So now my question has been, what does that mean? What does that mean to become the mountain? So I've been thinking about this a lot, and it's interesting because it's one of those things that, like he points to, it's hard to define, but you have sort of a sense of it. And Katagiri Roshi, my teacher, my ordination teacher, used to talk a lot about something which I think maybe comes from Dogen, but I don't know where it comes from. He said, when you first start practicing, mountain is mountain. Then mountain is not mountain. Finally, mountain is mountain. And so, of course, at first I thought, what does that mean? I mean, of course, there was that first kind of like, oh, but then it was like, what does that mean? So, I often thought about that. I thought about, what does that mean? What does mountain is not mountain mean? I knew that at some level, I knew kind of letting go of something. And when we let go, in Christianity, there's the phrase, let go and let God. When we let go, whatever God is, and Buddhism doesn't use a word. One of my students who was Jewish told me one time that in Judaism, they don't say the name of Yahweh or God, because if you use a word, you begin to define it intellectually, and you can't define what God is. So I don't know what happens when we let go, but I know that when we let go, there's a shift, and there's an experience of being within life, not just seeing ourselves in relation to everyone else or in relation to everything, which is the way we usually see things. But it's more of an experience than it is something that we can understand or explain intellectually. And Dogen Zenji talks about this in the Bendo Law. He talks about Jiju Zanmai. Zanmai means samadhi. Samadhi means oneness, experience of oneness. And Jiju Yu means experiencing. Ji is the self. Ju is the practice of, it's not the practice, it's the reality of giving and receiving. Ju is usually translated as to receive, but actually it's giving and receiving is the same practice. And originally the original Chinese, very primitive character for Jew, pronounced Jew in Japanese, I don't know how it's pronounced in Chinese, but that same character had a hand that's got like a very kind of primitive picture of a hand that is reaching down, and another hand that is reaching up. And in the middle is this very simple boat shape. So it's the vehicle of giving and receiving. No, receiving can't happen without giving, giving can't happen without receiving. So, and you means function, but you, when it's used together as a compound, means the joy of this experience of giving and receiving. And to me, what that is describing, it's describing what life is. And as I was saying earlier, we usually see our life, we see ourselves in relation to other people. We compare ourselves with other people, or we see ourselves in relation to animals. Other people think we are superior to animals, or we are superior to plants, or that we can control things in our life. But the actual underlying truth of life is that we don't exist in separation from everything else, that we're part of everything else. But we get confused by this discriminating mind that we have that causes us to feel like we are different from, or we live in relationship to rather than in relationship with. So this first mountain is mountain, and this is a description that I got from the internet. It's probably an AI description. This mountain is mountains are mountains. This represents the initial unexamined view of reality, where things are seen as they appear without questioning their nature. That is the deeper nature, which is the interrelationship between everything. It's a state of simple, direct perception, where a mountain is just a mountain and nothing more. And because my teacher used to talk about it all the time, I dug around until I found his explanation of it. So I want to share that with you. The first stage, mountains are mountains. This is very common. This is a very common understanding of mountains and you. Between you and the mountains, there's a very dualistic aspect of human life there. So first of all, you have to initiate moving toward the mountains through your 6 consciousnesses, seeing, hearing, communicating, or doing something with these mountains initiatively. So in other words, we think we have to do something in order to experience what the mountains are. You have to move first, otherwise the mountain doesn't come up to you. If you wait without doing anything, so you have to do it. That is mountains are mountains. So the second one is described not by him, but in this thing I found online. This stage signifies a deeper understanding, a glimpse into the emptiness or interconnectedness of all things. Emptiness is referring to everything, nothing, everything is empty of a permanent nature. That things are always changing and everything is empty of an individual nature. That without that interrelationship with other beings and recognition of the constant changing that's going on, we really are not experiencing life in its fullness. So this stage signifies a deeper understanding, a glimpse into the emptiness or interconnectedness of all things. It's a recognition that conventional labels and categories are ultimately limited and don't fully capture the nature of reality. So after Katagiri Roshi talks about our mountains as our initial thinking that in order to experience the mountains, we have to do something. Then he says, but this is really a human delusion. Even the bodhisattvas, even the Buddha, can't escape this delusion. That's why Dogen Zenji says, he says a little differently, but Katagiri Roshi's kind of rephrasing it. If you move initiatively toward the object, trees, birds, in order to compose a poem of the pine tree or whatever, that is called delusion. So going towards something, thinking we have to, with our mind or with our senses, thinking we have to experience it in those ways is delusion, according to Dogen Zenji, according to Katagiri Roshi. Me too, I agree. But then Roshi says, but delusion is important for us. Without delusion, we cannot understand anything. Also, we can't stop deluding. Because without delusion, we cannot communicate anything. Delusion is a hint where you are, where your actions are. Delusion is a signal to watch where you are present, what you are doing. The problem with delusion is that usually we don't see it. But in Zazen, when we're just sitting and looking at a wall, we start to notice. We start to notice the ways in which we overthink things. We start to notice the ways in which we think that we can only experience things with our senses. Zazen is sort of like a sensory deprivation tank. When we sit there looking at a wall, there's not a lot for our senses to experience. Of course, we hear things and we think, but we also notice how we're hearing things, how we're thinking about things, how we are so dependent on our eyes to see things in order to verify their reality. And touch and taste, those are the six senses: our eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. It is a sense in Buddhist thinking. So first of all, you have to move toward the pine tree to make a poem about it. But this is delusion. Because still there is some gap between you and the pine tree. So you have to completely project yourself into the pine tree. That's called empathy. You have to empathize yourself to the pine tree. But empathy is still a human attitude in terms of psychological viewpoint. So this is nothing but human action taking place at the first stage. Empathy seems to be good, but it's still at the first stage. For this, in order to empathize you into the pine tree, it really requires your enormous effort beyond your sense of like or dislike. That's Zazen. Like and dislike really come up during Zazen. I always say, right effort is just getting yourself to the cushion. Because when we get to the cushion and sit down, everything comes up, all our stuff. Things we like, things we don't like, things we don't have any relationship to, it all comes up. It really requires enormous effort, enormous attention, enormous energy to move toward it. And when I read something like enormous energy, I think back almost to the very beginning when I first started meditating at Minnesota Zen Center with Katagiri Roshi. I had been living about 2 miles away, and I was getting up a couple times a week and walking to Zazen because buses don't go that early. Because it was at 5 o'clock in the morning. And finally, I moved closer, about 5 blocks away. And I remember mornings and it was summertime, it was August when I moved closer to the Zen Center. I remember mornings when I thought, oh, I don't want to get up this morning. And then I thought, if I can't do it now, I'm never going to be able to do it in the winter. And it was that kind of, it was an enormous effort for me to get myself up and walk 5 blocks to the Zen Center. So that's kind of the way I think in Zazen, at different stages, it requires more effort. But the more that we make that enormous effort, and the more that we experience what we experience in Zazen, which is letting go, getting overthinking, and then letting go, and then thinking. And every time we notice that, every time we notice the ways in which we're thinking, the ways in which we distract ourselves from the experience of the present moment, the oneness of, with the interdependence, that moment of letting go, we experience everythingness. I like to call it's called emptiness. Shunyata is translated as emptiness. I like to call it everythingness because really that's what it is. It's experience everythingness. And when Dogen Zenji talks about Jiju Zamai, the joy of experiencing, of self-experiencing this oneness, he goes on to say, but this is not something we experience with our conscious mind. He says, the trees and grasses and walls and fences, everything begins to expound the truth. But this is not something we experience with our conscious mind. And this is what happens in Zazen. We have this experience. And I once asked my teacher, Katagiri Roshi, I said, so if we can't understand this experience when we're having it, is this something we kind of recognize in retrospect? And he said, yes. So it's not really something we can experience when we have it. But as I often say, when people used to ask me when I first started meditating at Zen Center, why do you sit there and face a wall? Why do you do this? I'd say, I don't know, but when I get up, I feel different. And even from the first time when I was only able to sit still for about 5 minutes before I started going to Zen Center, when I was just trying to meditate on my own, I noticed that when I stood up, something had shifted. And Dogen Zenji says this, he said, every time that you sit down and shut up, which is what Katagiri Roshi said, that's shikantaza. Shikantaza means just sit. To just get yourself to the cushion and sit down, even for 3 minutes, even for 5 minutes, there is that experience of letting go. Maybe more times than you even realize. And the more that we have that experience, the more we trust that experience. When we first have it, we judge everything, immediately. And so was that real or wasn't it? It's kind of unfamiliar. So we might say, oh, I just fell asleep for a second. But then sometimes people come to me and they'll say, I feel like I fall asleep during Zazen, but it's not exactly really sleep. So there's that, begins to be that recognition that, and the judgment starts to become less. And when we stop judging something as not real because it's not familiar, when we start seeing this is just another way of experiencing life, at that time, we start to trust that experience, and then we're able to experience it a little bit more through our daily life. But Zazen, Za means to sit, Zen means to meditate. to just sit down and shut up for a period of time with the support of other people. That's helpful. But even without it, we can start to have that experience. And it helps us to learn to recognize it and not be so easily persuaded to only see things from that discriminating point of view. So he talks about the second stage. The first stage, from this first point, no one can escape human effort. Every day you have to make every possible effort to live in this world. So he's not saying that this first stage, that it's useless because we live in the discriminating world, and we have to learn how to live within that. From this first stage, you move toward object. At the second stage, you are not moving toward object. You are completely drawn into the object. This means the object catches you immediately. You are drawn in by the object, even though you don't move. Your object brings you into your object without any effort, without your sense. So that is called egolessness. Egolessness is not a nihilistic understanding. Egolessness is really the manifestation of your full energies. At a point where we don't insert our intellect into our experience. And the first time that I ever really fully experienced kind of what he's talking about here was when I sat down to meditate up in the mountains. I was just beginning to do meditation practice on my own. I had done it when I was younger, and then it kind of I had kind of a back and forth with it for many years. And then when I really started to get into Zen meditation, I went up to the mountains in Alberta, Canada, up in Jasper, Alberta. And I was sitting at the free camp, which is on the Athabasca River. It's beautiful. It's the Rocky Mountains up in northern Canada. And I sat down in meditation. And I really had this experience, I guess, of the mountains, although I didn't really describe it in that way. But it was a full, I don't know how to describe it. I wasn't sitting there for very long, but I think it's what kind of propelled me into the Zen world, to the point where here I am. At the second stage, that's where mountains are not mountains. Because the mountains are not mountains, you are moving at, because the mountains are exactly you, because you are drawn in by the mountains before you are conscious of the mountain. You can experience this. If you really take care of your job, your occupation, even cleaning the floor, washing the dishes, everyday life, you can really experience this. At that time, the dishes are not dishes. The dishes are exactly you. You are drawn in completely by the dishes, the function of the dishes, the function of the mountains. How can I express this? There is no I, so only the mountains. But the mountains are not the idea of mountains in terms of common sense. The mountains are not mountains. So the mountains which are not mountains are really identical with the full function of your life. So this is like not defining God. When Father Thomas Keating was in Asheville, I did a day-long workshop, and he talked about centering prayer. Centering prayer is to sit quietly and let God speak to you. And afterwards, there was a reporter there from the Citizen Times who said to me, and who also practiced Zen, And he said to me, so what do you think of this? How does this compare with the kind of meditation that you do? And I said, and what immediately struck me is that it's really the same thing. Now, centering prayer doesn't emphasize sitting upright with your back straight. It's just you can sit any way you want, but just to sit and be quiet. And this experience is simply the centering prayer experience is the same as Teijo. It's simply to experience life as it is. It's just to allow life to speak to you. Let's talk about the voiceless voice of the universe. When you learn something from the mountain's life, at that time, it's really something wonderful. Something more than joy, but anyway, joy. Or in Zen, maybe this is called enlightenment or satori. Satori is not something complicated you have to learn. Satori is found in the very simple movement, which is exactly fit into the rhythm. Sometimes people call that going with the flow. And we do have that experience. Everybody knows that experience of kind of being in the flow of life, being in the rhythm of life. But the problem is that usually we don't know how we got there. We're just there. But when we experience this again and again in Zazen, we begin to, on some level, trust this experience in such a way that we can let go of that tendency to want to grasp onto it. Satori is not something complicated you have to learn. Satori is found in the very simple movement, which is exactly fit into the rhythm of you and the mountains fit together. At that time, there is full communication between you and the mountains. This is called kanodoko in Japanese. Kan means perception, literally. Perception means not only through the six senses, not only through consciousness. Perception means to receive the mountains with your whole body, which exists in the present and the past and the future. So if you perceive the mountains with your whole body, which has been handed down from generation to generation, from the past to the present to the future, at that time, you have really great communication. That is no of kano. No means respond. So you have to respond, but respond to the mountains, your whole body. When your whole body responds to the mountain's life, at that time it's called inspiration. It's something more than you think you want to know. But it is represented as lots of questions in your life, those inspirations. Many things in the world of inspiration are kind of questions, lots of questions you don't know the answer to. Like, what's that? All these questions come up. These questions are not something you can resolve in the realm of intellect or with intellectual research, but only within movement, only within responding to the rhythm of life, which mountains have. If you really respond to this, that response is not kind of intellectual inspiration, it's movement. So within the movement, there's full communication there. That is climbing the mountain. So when you are completely drawn in by the mountains and living with the mountains, your living is exactly identical with that of the mountains. And you have to die exactly with the mountains, be alive with the mountains. If you do this very naturally within each movement, responding to the voiceless voice that the mountain has, there is wonderful inspiration, so-called learning the mountains. It is more than intellectual research. It's not a sort of big thing or fourth dimension. It's really simple. Apparently, it's just like the same things, religiously speaking. Katagiri is Katagiri. Mountains are mountains. Nothing different. But within the materialistic aspect of Katagiri and mountains, there is an enormous function of communication between you and the mountains. In the Mountains and Waters Sutra commentary in the introduction by my friend Joachim Gamora, he says, Dogen says mountains and waters are themselves sutra. Sutra means the teaching. It means the teaching about the truth of life. So in this Mountains and Waters Sutra, Dogen is saying that the mountains and waters are themselves the teaching of truth, and that we should respond to them in that way. Somewhere in this introduction, Joachim is also he's giving a commentary on this teaching of Dogen's, but in the introduction he is talking about he's talking about Dogen's pointing to the many flavors of mountains. And I was thinking about that. I think that's an important thing to recognize, that the mountains and the rivers have many flavors. And I was thinking about all the mountains that I've experienced. The first were those mountains. I grew up in Flatland, Minnesota, where there were mountains at one time, but then the glaciers came down the middle and cleared all the mountains over time. And so what you have, the mountains that you have in Minnesota and on the other side of Minnesota, North Dakota and South Dakota, are cut off mountains. They're old mountains that were cut off by the glaciers, and they're called bluffs. So actually my first experience of mountains were when I went to South Dakota and I lived on the bluffs overlooking the Missouri River and cutting off next to, actually not next to Minnesota, it's kind of a ways in, so part of South Dakota is cut off. And my experience at our monastery in Minnesota, which is on the other side of Minnesota, right on the Mississippi River. Mississippi flows between Minnesota and Wisconsin. So there's also bluffs. So I've experienced both of those kind of mountains. And the bluffs are just like straight down on one side, and then they're softly flowing. But my experience on the Rockies, when I went up to Jasper, I remember I wasn't thinking about it. My friend had talked me into going on a trip with her, and I was kind of between things. So we just got into her car and drove up to Canada. And it was my first time camping, and it was kind of the first time of a lot of things. And then we got to Winnipeg, and some people at a campground told us about we should go to the mountains. There was a free camp up there. And so my friend Diana said, yes, we should do this. And so we drove up to the mountains, and when we drove, Canada is also very flat all the way between Winnipeg, at least between Winnipeg and the mountain. Mountains are in Quebec. I think they're in, no, they're not in Quebec's on it. What is it? Anyway, it's on the other side of Canada. So you go through Saskatchewan, and when we drove from Saskatchewan into the mountains, I remember having this experience of just my whole body just responding to the beauty or to the energy of the mountains. So these mountains have a certain kind of energy that affects you. I felt the same way on the bluffs and also at Hokyoji in Minnesota mountain. And the next mountains I experienced were in California. California has new mountains. The energy is completely different. I was kind of afraid of those mountains. Because they're new, you know, if you try to climb them, sometimes I experienced a lot of shale. I couldn't get up. I kept slipping on the shale. And at Tassajara, there was always big boulders coming down the mountain and landing on the road and blocking the road. And big the size of a room. And so it was a different kind of experience than I experienced kind of things coming apart easily. And the next experience I had was on Japanese mountains, which are in some ways similar because they're newer mountains. People don't build in the mountains. Japan, and most of the temples that you find in the monasteries are at the foot of the mountain. First of all, there's peacefulness and a connection with the mountain, but there's also, it's a place where people don't like to build because there's always things, disruption, volcanoes. Yeah, I don't know too much about those mountains because I didn't live there too long. But then, my next experience of the mountains was Mount Fuji. And my friends took me there. I had never been able to see Mount Fuji. I had taken that train that it has a stop called Viewing Mount Fuji. But every time I went to that stop, Mount Fuji was all clouded over, which is very common for Mount Fuji. So it's kind of a big thing to be able to see Mount Fuji. So I never saw it. And so my friends one day said, we're going to take you to Mount Fuji. I was visiting Japan at the time. And I said, you can't see Mount Fuji. And they said, well, we know this place where you can see Mount Fuji. Every time we've ever been there, you could see it. So we're going to take you there. So I said, okay. So we're driving along, and I had two American people from Tree with me at the time. We're driving along, and my friends are chatting in the front seat, and all of a sudden, one of the people from the United States said to me, "Is that Mount Fuji?" We're driving, and I said, well, it couldn't be because they didn't say anything. So she said, "It looks like Mount Fuji." I looked at it, and I asked my friends, and they looked up and they said, "Oh yeah, that's Mount Fuji." And I just had this sense of it, and I really didn't. I used to say, well, what's the big deal about Mount Fuji anyway? You know, it's just a mountain, right? But I had such a powerful experience of the presence of Mount Fuji when we were just driving along, and I saw it, that now I want to go back. Now I have this feeling like I want to go back and experience Mount Fuji. And then of course there's the Appalachians too. I mean, actually, that I had that experience before, and the Appalachians are the oldest mountains in the world. So they have this sort of embracing presence. There are people from Minnesota who have tried to move to Asheville, and they can't stand it because they feel claustrophobic. But that's not the way that I feel. I feel that they're soft mountains that are embracing me. That's a different experience. And in 2019, I had the experience of seeing the Alps, or experiencing the Alps. And I got to say, every one of and the Alps are, oh my gosh, I can't even explain it. But every one of these mountain ranges had a different flavor. And this speaks to me in a certain way. What is the flavor of becoming the mountain? what is, and Dogen Zenji, in this sutra that we're reading about in our study group, we're reading the Mountain and Waters Sutra, the Mountain and Waters Dharma of Dogen, and also a commentary by my friend Shohak. What is the flavor of becoming one with the Lord, becoming the Lord? That's the Lord talks about in Dogen. Dogen says this is the way to experience the mountain, to just let the mountain embrace you. Anytime I come back to Asheville from somewhere else, whether I'm driving in or flying in, the very first time I flew into Asheville, I wasn't living here at the time. I was teaching at Southern Dharma for the first time. I was in 1989. And the very first time, I was very stunned by the beauty of the mountains as we flew in, but it was more than just seeing them. It was feeling them. I have lots of mountain experiences driving through the mountains of New Mexico and Albuquerque when I was on my quest to find a teacher. It was nighttime, but I remember feeling those mountains. Couldn't see them, feeling. So we're so fortunate to be in these wonderful mountains, old mountains that have such a voiceless voice. How do we become them? This is what our practice helps us to do. And it helps us in every part of our life, whether we're washing dishes. The other day Genjo and I went to visit a person who practiced at Southern Dharma or at Urban Dharma and join their chanting for her. She's dying. Now, Tibetans do a lot of chanting, which once chanted for an hour. And I remember thinking as we were chanting, we were standing, and we were kind of tired from standing for it. I remember thinking, this chanting, just chanting and chanting and chanting like this, it at a certain point, there's a kind of letting go that happens within that chanting. So it's that same kind of experience in our practice. We experience it as just sitting. Thich Nhat Hanh emphasizes that same sort of thing. Just be present. But that being, in order to be present, we have to let go of our ideas of what it means to be present, and we have to let go of what our mind is obsessing over at that moment, or what our mind is grasping onto at that moment. And when you just have to chant, and it was a kind of situation where we were just joining in with this Tibetan chanting, and I didn't know how long it was going to go on. And there were those moments when I was like, how much longer are we going to do this? And then they brought lunch, and couldn't serve lunch because we were chanting and thinking, we should finish up because lunch, But then realizing that this chanting for this person was way more important for her than having lunch. Just all these things that happen within the context of our practice, within chanting, there's a lot of letting go in morning service, from the bowing, the prostrations, the chanting. I've had that experience of the chanting and the rhythm of the bowing and everything just taking me right into a completely different space than what I was obsessing over a minute before that. So this is mountains are not mountains. It's when we, first of all, recognize non-substantiality of those things that we attach to, recognize that we are one with life, not apart from what life is, and stepping into the rhythm and finding the rhythm. And I was thinking as I was reading this, I was thinking also, this is why we can experience other practitioners. And I point to people like my teacher, Katagiri Roshi, or Thich Nhat Hanh, or the Dalai Lama. When you're in the presence of these people, there's a kind of a transformation that takes place. There's something that draws you to their energy because they know how to live that experience of constantly being able to engage in life and let go, kind of almost at the same time, but engage when it's necessary to engage and recognize when we're getting too attached, know how to let go. And as Katagiri Roshi says, even if we know how to do this, we have to constantly be able to go back and forth. We have to constantly recognize when we're grasping at something which is delusion and step back, take a step back. And Dogen Zenji describes this practice of zazen when he explains how to do zazen in something called the Fukan Zazengi. He says it's the backward step that turns the light inwardly to experience the self. And the self is not experience of an intellectual idea of what we are, but the experience of the self, which is everything else. So it's after 11, so I guess we won't have discussion today. Thank you. Are we going to have announcements and then give back the merit, or give back the merit and then? Let's have announcements.
Okay. There's a lot of stuff happening. So first off, next week's discussion, next week's lecture, Genjo will be speaking, and the title of his talk is Mindful Politics, which reminds me that, so we have, right now we're in a practice period, a long practice period that we're actually splitting into 3 smaller practice periods in April, May, and June. And there's 2 different study groups that will be going on. So Teijo is leading one about the Mountain Seed Ceremony, and Genjo is leading one about mindful politics. So if you want to join Genjo's study group, there's no commitment to show up, bring friends. We are reading a book, but you don't have to read the book, you can just show up. But I will be sharing the chapter that we're reading every week. But it's just supposed to be sort of like figuring out how to engage in this world. So really looking forward to Genjo's talk. There's also a full moon gathering next Saturday on that same day. We are going to have a family meditation at the end of the month as well. And also, just in general, we're looking for volunteers for the Mountain Seed Ceremony. So there's so much to be done, you know, kind of around the property and planning logistics and stuff. So if you have time to volunteer, please let me know. You can email me at info@retreat.org.
And what we're studying actually in this these mini practice periods is this book, this commentary on Dogen's teaching about mountains and waters. So it's not really related to the Mountain Seed Ceremony. I just chose it because it's had mountains in it. And I sort of wanted to see I wanted to sort of study a little more deeply what Dogen has to say about mountains. And it's still possible. We had the opening tea and we're discussing when we're going to meet, but we haven't actually started reading yet. So there's still time to join the April study group if you want to, but you have to commit. And if you want to join, probably the best way is to just let me know. Right. write to Teijo at greattreetemple.org, or info at greattreetemple.org, and we'll let you know when we're meeting, because we're still talking, we're trying to juggle everyone's schedules and find, so we'll be meeting 4 times, and then we'll have a closing tea at the end, and then we'll do the same thing in May, continuing with this same book, and then the same thing in June. So if you want to commit yourself for just 1 mini practice period, you can do that. Okay.
And Genjo's study group is just every Wednesday evening.
Yeah, every Wednesday at 6:30. Starts with meditation, and then, you want to say?
Sure. We start with 25 minutes of meditation at 6:30, similar to this morning. Have a 5-minute break and then discuss from 7.
Can we do it online too? Yes. Okay.
Yeah, and either of these you can do online. And also, what did I start to say? Oh, with Genjo's, it's drop in when you can, but it's every Wednesday night. With the one that I'm leading, it kind of builds and deepens when you have everyone committing to it. So I like to do it that way.
Yeah, the book we're reading is called Mindful Politics, and it's a collection of essays by different kind of engaged Buddhist teachers, Dalai Lama, Bell Hooks, several others. And so
Katagiri Roshi.
Katagiri Roshi, yeah.
He's got one in there.
Yeah. And so yeah, it's just taking it week by week, and we're not going necessarily linear fashion. So we decided to decide each week what we'll be reading for the next week, and Quinn's going to put that in the email newsletter. And like Quinn said, yeah, you don't have to have read the essay to come to the group. You know, everyone can be mindful, and everyone is engaged in politics because of human form, and we're here now. So we just show up.
Okay, now we'll give back the merit. So I'll say a line and you can all respond. May the merit of this practice benefit all beings and bring peace. So now I'll do 3 prostrations, and then we'll have the 4 bell exit.